This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. Are you left wanting more at the end of each episode of this show? Are these short sessions getting you fired up to try new skills for yourself and share the journey with others who are working through the same challenges? Well, the good news is that this podcast is only the beginning. The real action and learning is happening on the Regenerative Skills Discord channel, where you can connect with the whole community to dive deeper into the topics on the show, explore solutions, and share your journey and blooper reel with an active group that can't wait to hear from you. You can get your questions answered and share knowledge and wisdom of your own on a safe platform that, unlike the social media giants, won't steal your personal data to advertise to you in creepy ways. Ditch Facebook and join us where the real skill builders are. Just find the link to the Discord chat on the homepage at regenerativeskills.com. Hey everybody, and welcome back. So I've been watching an interesting and important discussion play out for a number of years now with the environmental movement and the ecological farming community. It appears that on one hand, we have a group that is convinced by the data that farming to feed a population which is growing exponentially through traditional land-based means is doomed to be an ecological detriment. Our current system should instead be replaced with high-tech solutions, such as vertical farms and laboratory processes, to create the nutrition that this population needs. And as a result, we could return much of the farmland to rewilding efforts to recover the natural environments and biodiversity that we've lost, in no small part due to modern agriculture. Now, on the other side, we have people who are convinced by the data, often the same data, that we need to return to a deeper and more compassionate relationship with the earth, and one that allows us to produce a yield without compromising the ability of all other life forms to exist and thrive. And this way, we can both feed the population and restore our role as environmental stewards. Rather than returning many farms to rewild, we could incorporate habitat and biodiversity into our production methods and foster the recovery of wild species in a way that enhances the resilience of our production methods. Instead of isolating human activity from a pristine concept of the natural world and permitting destructive actions in the remaining space, we could consider all of our necessary functions within a globally connected landscape for their potential to enhance all forms of life, not just our own. Now, these two contrasting worldviews recently came to a head during a debate between Alan Savory and George Monbiot. Alan represented the side of holistic management, taking into account the infinite complexity of the natural world to create management frameworks to operate with this nuance in a way that respects all the cycles of life-affirming principles of our world. George has been an outspoken critic of this position, especially in how it relates to the management of livestock in farming, arguing that there is no potential for beneficial ecological outcomes in livestock farming, and that in order to combat the climate crisis and mass biodiversity loss, high-efficiency farming must be leveraged, along with technology such as precision fermentation, to produce plant-based protein alternatives to meat. Now, I've linked to the video recording of the debate in the show notes for this episode on the website in order to let you make up your own mind about which side you support. I also want to express that I don't consider these two positions, certainly not in their rigidity, as the only positions in the broader discussion. At the same time, I know that anyone who has listened to more than a few episodes of this show will know which direction I lean personally. Now, this brings me to today's interview, in which I'll be speaking with Chris Smaje. Chris is a university-based social scientist turned farmer. He has co-run a small farm and market garden for the last 20 years. Along with farming, he is a dedicated voice for regenerative and locally based food systems. He's the author of A Small Farm Future, which articulates his vision and the details of a society built around local economies and food systems, and his most recent title, Saying No to a Farm-Free Future, which directly confronts the popular arguments in favor of manufactured food and removing food production from the land. Now, in our conversation, we start by identifying the sources and advocacy of industrially produced food and farm alternatives. We break down the manipulation of data and reductionist thinking that results in conclusions that technological fixes are our only option. Chris also paints a picture of his ideas of a brighter alternative to these conclusions and what is possible in a more locally based and decentralized configuration of our sources of sustenance. We also dig into the active role that all of us can play in creating this alternative future and accelerate a transformation in the role of farming, as well as supply and production of food to one that serves the broader community of life that we're all connected to. This is one of my favorite current subjects of exploration, as it is connected to so many aspects of how we live, organize ourselves, co-create culture and community, and manifest our future. I really hope to explore aspects of this with many more people and perspectives in the coming months. And so please, if there are people that you would like to hear me interview about these topics, or if you would like to add or to challenge any of the points in the upcoming discussion, I really encourage you to reach out on our Discord community or to me directly at info@regenerativeskills.com. So with that out of the way, I will hand things over now to Chris Smaje. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today. I think the topic that we're going to be exploring is extremely timely, but before we jump into the specifics of that, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what your impetus for writing this book was?
Right. Yeah. Hi. Thanks for inviting me on. My background is I'm a social scientist by training. I sort of spent the first part of my career in sort of universities and research institutes doing kind of different aspects, kind of sociology, anthropology, social policy. But then sort of in my 30s, kind of got drawn into, thinking about ecological threats, climate change, energy futures, and so on, thinking that the food and farming systems were sort of pretty key to that, and ended up with my wife starting a small farm market garden where I am here in Somerset, southwest England. So I was a grower for quite a few years, but more recently I've kind of got drawn back into the more sort of analytical kind of trying to figure out how we can sort of make agrarian localism, regenerative ag, and that whole suite of ideas. How can we amplify that narrative and sort of help it to address the poly crisis that we're currently in. So I wrote a book a couple of years back now, A Small Farm Future, where I sort of laid out some of my ideas there. Just published this other recent book called Saying No to a Farm-Free Future, which is engaging with the kind of eco-modernist techno-fix narrative that we can sort of move away from farming altogether and start producing foods in a it's kind of manufacturing using so-called precision fermentation techniques, and making more room for nature and so on. So I think there are some problems with that narrative, and George Monbiot is a sort of key figure there, whose book Regenesis has popularized that. I've interacted with George over the years quite positively for the most part, but not so positively around his enthusiasm for this for manufactured food, and some of his critiques of farming. I share a lot of his critique of mainstream farming, but I kind of think he's sort of gone down a sort of some questionable routes with his recent analysis. So kind of arising out of that, I started writing some critiques and making the case for agrarian localism as an alternative, and that sort of became the new book that has just been published.
Yeah, and like you said there is a lot of reason to look into the critiques around farming, because it's not without its own blame. It has had a devastating effect on the ecology in most parts of the world and contributed a lot to things like desertification, pollution of waterways, and on and on. And so there is a real reason to analyze exactly how we are managing our agricultural spaces. However, the conclusions that are brought to that are where you differ from these techno-modernists, as you say. Can you maybe outline some of the critiques that are worth giving credence to before we break into what some possible fixes could be?
Right. Well, yeah, I agree. I think one aspect of farming is you kind of have to connect it to the wider society and economy. And I think, one of the things that's going on here is that we've sort of got into this blame game where we're looking for culprits for the for the crises and the the impasse that we're in. And it's farmers basically have been asked to produce as much food and agricultural commodities as they possibly can, as cheaply as they possibly can, whilst staying afloat in the modern marketplace. And that has had catastrophic consequences. I would say largely in two ways. One, in terms of overproduction. There's just this huge impetus to produce more and more cheap global commodity crops as cheaply as possible, and every part of the world is basically incentivized to produce on the basis of comparative advantage, to produce the one or the handful of agricultural products it suited to producing, and to kind of flood that into global commodity markets. And that has been disastrous in at all sorts of levels, socially, economically, politically, ecologically. The other aspect of it is kind of getting labor out of farming. I mean, it's this kind of odd dynamic where almost every other sector we say, great, we've created more jobs in this sector, whereas farming, it's like, great, we've got we've saved labor, we've got we've destroyed jobs in this sector. And the way we've destroyed jobs, various ways, but a big part of it has been agrochemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and that they have had a disastrous impact. So if you put the sort of overproduction and the labor cutting by substituting essentially ecocidal chemicals, and these are in a sense, these are all derivatives, or they're all derived from the fossil fuel industry, which basically makes cheap energy and cheap petrochemicals available. That's a large part of the impasse we've got in. So it's I think I agree with you. It's right and proper to critique that that whole trajectory of farming. The problem is if you kind of point the finger at farmers specifically rather than us owning it as societies as a whole. We have pushed farmers collectively as modern societies down that route, and we have to collectively take responsibility for that. But the sort of farm free narrative is that, okay, well, farming didn't work out too well, for all the reasons we've just been discussing. Let's do something different. Like the main, I think the sort of narrative drive of the Regenesis book and of this kind of eco-modernist food narrative, Replanet and so on, is basically, let's take food production out of nature, off the farm, into factories. One of the main ways that the main suggestion for doing that is using bacteria to produce high protein. You basically produce a high protein slurry of dead microbial matter that you then kind of filter and process, and it becomes this kind of high protein, very purified food. I think there's a whole bunch of problems with that, but the main problem that the main technical problem that I talk about in my book is the energetic cost. You basically, farming ultimately uses sunlight, and one of the issues with sunlight is that it's diffuse, so farming has to be diffuse. And so we get into that debate about farming land take, but the solar energy is basically carbon free and free and economically free. If we're going to produce food through this sort of manufactured techniques, we have to use generated electricity. If we want to claim that it's low carbon and part of an ecological solution, we can't use fossil fuel, fossil derived electricity. We have to use clean, basically PV or wind or arguably nuclear energy. Already we're having to decarbonize the energy economy and use those forms of energy to do all the other things we might want to do. The process, replacing free sunlight with generated electricity seems kind of crazy to me, in as much as we already can't actually, we're not really decarbonizing the energy economy as it is, let alone doing without sunlight and trying to produce all our food that way. And it is much more energetically lower cost to produce food using sunlight than using this kind of route of generated electricity via microbes. And I kind of go, there's not a lot of discussion at this point, and I've had to kind of unpick it quite a bit in the book, because I think there's a lot of kind of corporate boosterism around these new food technologies, and talk about how it's more efficient, and we can debate whether it's more or less efficient, but it's high cost in terms of the cost of the generated electricity. And I think that's an important point for people to understand. It's not, it's a very, very costly process, in terms of supplying the energy to it, and a whole bunch of other reasons as well. But that's kind of a quick summary.
Yeah. And where do you see the most prominent voices that advocate for these as solutions coming from? Because I know you mentioned George Monbiot there, and he's become sort of a poster child for this way of looking at replacing conventional agriculture, or at least traditional agriculture done out in the fields, mostly using natural resources to produce consumables, into the technological fixes like you outlined there. But there are other sources that are advocating for this. Where do you see them coming from?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's a little bit of an unholy alliance between environmentalists who quite rightly care about nature and want to minimize human impacts on wider ecologies. We seems that we're in a potentially a kind of sixth mass extinction event caused by humans. So you've got to take seriously the impact that we're having on nature, which is not only driven by farming, but farming, certainly worldwide is a primary cause of biodiversity loss and all the rest of it. So there's that kind of environmentalist voice, but I think there's also a corporate voice, and you get into this whole debate about, the case for farming or for livestock is driven by corporations and industry, which it is, but farming in many ways has been less corporatized than just about every other sector of the economy. But certainly there are people like Bill Gates who quite openly talk about the fact that they've invested in low carbon energy industries, and in so-called alternative meat, or this sort of new manufactured proteins, as a way of making money. So I think there's definitely a corporate interest in it, a lot of kind of Silicon Valley money, and I think an interest in, essentially getting the consumer where corporations always want them to be, which is non-autonomous. If you can't produce food for yourself, if you're living in a city, if you're dependent on buying food from a sort of high-tech industrial supply chain, that makes you completely vulnerable to to the sort of corporate value scouring. So I think it's a little bit of an unholy alliance between environmentalists who, for all sorts of good reasons, want to lower the impact of farming, and this sort of corporate agenda. And I suppose one reason for me writing the book was, I think, that the sort of the radical environmental aspect of it pulls people into this narrative, which has much more questionable or cynical motives, on the grounds of, helping the poor, or, helping nature. But that's I don't think that ultimately, I don't think it will actually deliver those touted benefits that the environmentalists, or the sort of more radical political arguments in favor of it want. And actually it's very much more of a kind of corporate control, kind of value scouring narrative, and that's sort of what I want to draw attention to, really.
Yeah, I think that last point that you made there especially sums it up there, is that there is a lot of money being poured into this sector, and it seems to be the final loop that can be closed in the corporate and energy takeover of possibly the oldest industry that humans have ever been a part of, right? Or at least since the agricultural revolution, at least the way that we look at agriculture since the last 10, 15,000 years of cultivating fields and such.
I mean,
and because of that money, there's going to be a lot of talk around it. There's going to be investment opportunities, and these technologies are going to start to evolve into new things as those resources are poured into them. Do you see any possible positive effects coming from this, I guess, increase in technological resources being put into farming?
I mean, not really in terms of that style of investment. I mean, I think, we do need to be thinking a lot more and investing. I mean, I think not necessarily investing venture capital. I mean, one point I'd like to make here is that I think that the whole manufactured food idea, the microbial protein idea, is not really going to work out, sort of in terms of energy costs or capital costs. But one of the problems is the extent to which it will try and draw public money into it on the basis of this kind of environmental crisis narrative. So, a great book by Glenn Davis Stone called The Agricultural Dilemma, where he makes this point that so many of our agricultural technologies over the last 100+ years have kind of been about getting people off the land, getting ordinary people off the land, sort of stopping local communities from having food sovereignty and taking care of their own food production, and creating kind of big industrial technologies around agriculture, which essentially are a way of harvesting public money, harvesting taxation, on the grounds that we need governments to kind of invest in this technology. So there's kind of a resource suck from public into private money. If it was just a case of big private corporations spending their own money playing around with these technologies, which in fact they have been playing around with for quite a number of years, and it hasn't really gone anywhere, I think, because of the energetic difficulties I was mentioning. Where it has gone is kind of high value, low volume products like things like the sort of fake blood that is used in vegan burgers. The actual vegan burger is a farm product. It comes from soy or similar sorts of things, where the added corporate value is in the the little bit of fake blood or the little bit of sort of dressing on it, as it were. So that's where the technology has gone. Historically, the new idea is, hey, we can actually produce the bulk commodity here, but I'm not sure they can. So I think, for sure, we need to be investing our human ingenuity and our sort of pooled resources into rethinking farming. But I think that, I guess my argument is that has to come from the ground up. For sure, we need technological and science know-how, but it has to be addressed to sort of how we solve our sort of day-to-day food issues, at the grassroots level, not this kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all global high-tech solutionism that alienates people from access to whole foods locally, in their own communities.
Yeah, and I think one of the more powerful points that you've made up until this point is that the trajectory of going in that direction is a large part of why farming has become such a detrimental industry around the world anyway. And that to continue down that path is not going to take us in the direction that we would like to go if we are concerned about the environment and the economy of rural areas. There's so many things that you brought up there that we can pick apart individually. And if you'll allow me, I'm going to play devil's advocate for some of these to understand. Well, I'm probably not the best person to do this, because anyone who's listened to this show knows that we see quite eye to eye on this subject. However, let's give it a shot. So one of the things that you mentioned is that if you're budgeting for the energy that you're really losing out by transforming it in a technological way and then repurposing it into mechanical and technological ways of producing something that could be run directly off of sunlight out in the field. Now, someone in the technological sphere would probably say, well, look, these are new technologies, right? They are in their infancy. They will improve over time. And as we get better at, let's say, transferring solar energy via solar panels, or maybe even start to harvest things like tidal waves and other forms of these, constant forms of free ecological energy, then it'll start to come out. It'll start to balance out in the sheets, and then we may even become more efficient over time. Do you see that as a possibility?
I mean, well, I think there are some hard limits to that. I mean, one issue we have to bear in mind here is that time isn't really on our side. We need to decarbonize the energy economy over the next few decades. Otherwise, all bets are off about, the way the world is going to go. We're not actually decarbonizing it at the moment. I mean, last year, the world used more fossil energy than ever before. So, as I was saying earlier, the idea of, hey, let's actually add to our energetic needs by replacing free sunlight with generated energy doesn't seem like a good bet at the moment. But yes, it may get more efficient. I mean, again, we have to connect this to the wider economy, because for sure, if you look at the energy economy in recent years, there's way more low carbon energy in the energy mix now than there was 20, 30, 40 years ago. But all it's done really is added to our total energy use. It hasn't really substituted for any for existing fossil energy. Maybe that will start to happen, but it's kind of too little too late really at this stage. So when people say, well, we can find new ways of harvesting energy, I mean, yeah, probably, new and better ways, but there is a sort of more underlying, almost, a sort of cultural or a sort of spiritual issue. The issue isn't really our efficiency or our ability to harvest energy. It's kind of how we're organizing ourselves socially and economically. But even leaving aside that kind of bigger social context, there are some hard physical limits. There's a paper I cite in my book, which I'm not very good at remembering figures off the top of my head, but I think it's something like around 18 or 19 kilowatt hours per kilo of protein is a kind of hard biophysical limit to how much energy you need to produce microbial protein through the hydrogen oxygenating route. So that's already a higher energy use than we can produce. The easiest ways of producing protein via standard farming techniques by growing legumes, say. So I mean, yeah, for sure, it possibly will get a bit more efficient, but that is kind of missing where it connects to the economy and wider society. And I think in any case, there are biophysical limits to it when you set it alongside farming, because of the free solar energy that farming is able to tap.
All right, so let's go into one now that you also covered quite a bit in your previous book, A Small Farm Future. This is one that has been a narrative in many of our cultures for perhaps hundreds of years now, which is by reducing the labor on farms, we are freeing up people in rural areas from the drudgery of the lifestyle of working on a farm and giving them opportunities to do something else with their time. So by further mechanizing and reducing the labor that is required to produce things like protein and calories, although let's not reduce food to such a small thing, then this is actually helpful for the culture and for the people who would otherwise be shackled by working out in the fields. Right.
Well, I think the little caveat you just made is quite an important one, actually, that, let's not reduce food to calories or protein, because that, we've got this huge kind of global health crisis, really, which has resulted from, the way that we've mechanized food has made whole foods, fruit and vegetables and so on, has made them basically unaffordable to huge swathes of the population. And, people, would otherwise be looking to have would be able to produce a much greater diversity of diet. So the way that we've mechanized people out of farming has actually been catastrophic health-wise, really. But, I think potentially there is a grain of truth to that argument. I mean, I don't like to sort of overly extol I don't want to create some kind of overly idyllic vision of what farming, small scale farming can be like. Equally, though, it's the history of that hasn't been this kind of people downing their hand tools as soon as they got the opportunity to move to the city. It's been a process very often, very largely, of enclosure, of people being forced to to some extent to being forced into global industrial agricultural production. I mean, the whole history of slavery, sort of illustrates that in a sort of tragic and catastrophic way. So it hasn't been an idyllic process of industrialization. But I would agree to some extent that we've been through a historical period where a degree of industrialization and capitalization has generated economic growth that has enabled some proportion of the world's people to enjoy more income and more opportunities. I mean, I'm kind of, I accept there's a grain of truth in that narrative, but you also have to look at the darker side of that in terms of the kind of exploitation that exists in sort of global economic connections. But I guess my argument really is that we're coming to an end of that period in history when vast industrialization generated huge rates of economic growth. I mean, we're already at a stage of economic precarity in the big global mega cities, where processes of labor rationalization in industry is pushing a lot of people into very precarious service sector type jobs. And then we're looking at the bigger geopolitics now as energy and resources squeeze. We're going to see the big global powers. I mean, I'll talk about this a bit in my book. We're already seeing sort of China, India, Russia, the USA, the EU, all kind of jockeying with each other over over access to resources. So in that situation, the idea that, hey, let's get people out of the countryside, let's concentrate them in big mega cities, which are incredibly reliant on cheap energy, electricity, basically, and the existing unsustainable global energy economy. That argument, I can see how, if we were having this discussion in sort of 1890, I think you would have a better case to make. But we're having this discussion now. I think the argument to get people out of the countryside, concentrate them into cities, it's not a good bet in terms of global geopolitics and global energy economics.
Yeah. Okay. How about the one about freeing up land for wildlife? If we concentrate our food production into factories and just make it a smaller footprint on the land itself, then we can rewild all of this former farmland that was dedicated to pastures or to row cropping, and we can start to heal the biodiversity loss that has been caused as agriculture expands to meet the demand of a growing population.
Right. Well, I think that's probably the best of your devil's advocate arguments. I mean, we definitely need to reduce our agricultural footprint and to make more room for nature. There are questions about how we do that. What's the best way of trying to do that? Is it to invest, our already very squeezed energy economy into this kind of untried new technology, which we claim will, will be able to bring more people into the cities. Even if that works, which I don't think it will, how is that going to play out longer term? Are all the people that we've sort of removed from nature suddenly going to start caring about, the wider ecology? What's going on in the parts of the world where their products are coming from that they don't see, that they're not involved in. The ecocidal nature of modern civilization is very much driven by urbanization, industrialization. Is a further iteration of that. Actually, although it might, we might be able to lower our agricultural footprint a bit, but is that really going to generate a kind of ecological civilization long term? I would argue probably not. But yeah, we definitely need to reduce our footprint. But that goes back to what I was saying earlier. How do we do that? For one thing, we need to, we really need to focus on fossil fuels and cut them out of our energy mix. If we do that, I think we're looking at lower energy ways of life. That will mean that we'll need to generate more of our resources locally. It'll mean that we can't just be profligately using, producing food, as cheaply as we can wherever we can in the world. We'll actually have to start caring for local landscapes. It'll mean probably eating less meat, which I agree with the kind of rewilding narrative that meat, it does have a bigger footprint. There's definitely a place for it in farming and particularly in lower energy farming, but not as a way of sort of adding value by growing huge amounts of cheap commodity crops and pouring them down the throats of animals. So really it's about I think the sort of premise of your question is right. We do need to lower our ecological footprint, our ecological impacts, and our agricultural footprint. The question is how we do that. I think the way we need to do it is it's a much kind of harder in a way idea of really looking at how we are operating as ecological protagonists within our landscapes, not a kind of techno fix that we pull down from on high. But yeah, we need to do it. We need to farm more ecologically for sure. But I think the key thing there is to actually look at local the possibilities of local landscapes to produce food that people living in those landscapes need, not to produce as much agricultural commodities to sell into global markets as possible. So going back to that narrative of overproduction I was talking about, it's like weaning ourselves off agricultural overproduction by reconnecting with local needs, not global market demands, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dig a little deeper into that one specifically about meat, because this argument comes from both, vegetarian and vegan advocates, as well as this technological, modernist farming narrative for the future, which is that, well, meat production just takes up so much space all around the world, and it is an extremely inefficient, for size of land to output of protein equation for producing protein mostly, right? And that it is also one of the biggest drivers for things like destruction of the rainforest as it expands to put pastures into areas that did not hold them previously. And depending on how it's managed, destruction of traditional grassland areas leading to desertification and such. And by replacing our protein production through these more efficient processes of, like you're talking about, precision fermentation of grain, soy, and other grain products, it is a much more direct and efficient way of getting protein through direct production of plants over to a population that is, of course, growing. How do you see that fitting into both, the trajectory of going towards a more mechanized process and maybe some alternatives to it?
Yeah, well, it's very complicated, but
It is.
I guess my starting position My starting position would be to basically agree with the vegan critique of existing agriculture. That I mean, the sort of existing meat production system is kind of a horror show. But it has arisen really out of that overproduction dynamic, which is either producing the sort of parts of the world that are pastoral and are best at producing grazing ruminants. They are incentivized to produce as many of them as they possibly can. As they possibly can. Other parts of the world are producing cheap commodity crops, cereals and grain legumes, and then adding value by pouring them down the throats of livestock. So yeah, that is not a good way to go. What we need to do is figure out local systems addressing local food needs in low energy ways. Not using a lot of fossil fuel inputs. If you do that, if you look around the world, pretty much every part of the world has figured out a low energy local farming system, and livestock fit into that. If you think about all the traditional farm animals, basically what they do is tap and cycle nutrients within the farm system, which are otherwise hard for people to access directly. And typically you'll have like a rotation with you'll have fields in fallow that you will graze livestock in. You then will grow you'll grow crops, and then sort of cycle back into fallow to rest and rotate and build the soil, and livestock sort of fit into that rotation. But not to the extent that you can eat meat at the levels that we've become accustomed to in rich parts of the world like the US or Western Europe. So yeah, for sure, we need to cut livestock, or we need to cut. So we need to cut livestock. We don't necessarily. It depends where you're. We need to cut our easy recourse to cheap meat as part of a kind of modern consumerism. But it does get complicated because, you can sort of say, oh, we should just rewild. It very much depends on the local situation. There are wild grazing ruminants. There are large parts of the world which have a kind of grassland ecosystem, which historically have been maintained by ruminants and sometimes by domestic, human grazed ruminants. You get into all sorts of highly technical questions about methane, about soil carbon sequestration, about reforestation, about albedo, and so on. And ultimately, I kind of think we've gone a little bit too far down this route of trying to count carbon costs very minutely and say, we should be reforesting, or we should be doing this or that. What we actually need to be doing is creating renewable local food and farming systems, as people have done in the past. And I kind of get a lot of pushback on this along the lines of, oh well, there's 8 billion people on the planet now, we can't do that. But actually human labor, going back to one of your earlier questions, is hugely productive of food in low impact ways, if that's what we choose to devote human labor to. The kind of modern industrial farming system is not necessarily more productive of food per acre. It's more productive of food per agricultural worker, going back to your question about kind of getting labor out of agriculture. So yeah, for sure, we need to rethink the meat and the farming system, but livestock have their place in renewable farming systems, and particularly I think in not so much to feed the consumers of rich urban places, but there are traditional pastoralist systems where people have figured out very low impact, very biodiverse systems of herding ruminants. And one of my fears about this whole kind of manufactured food narrative is that it can be used and is being used essentially to point the finger at traditional pastoralists who have very little political power and voice and tell them that they are agents of ecological destruction, when in fact they're not. If anything, the opposite. The people who are agents of ecological destruction are rich people living in cities in the global north. So for sure, we need to look at our food consumption and our meat consumption, and our tendency to be consumers, drawing down on the food system rather than sort of adding to adding to local resilience and adding to local food systems. So it's complicated at so many levels, and I think you can't really generalize. You can't really say meat is bad, or livestock are bad globally. They definitely are bad in all sorts of particular settings, but that's where we need to have a more nuanced and localized debates about food, and sort of reconfigure the food system to be sort of keyed into to local ecologies. Sorry, very long answer, but
no. I completely agree. It's a good segue into a very recent and relevant event for what we're talking about. We're just a couple of weeks past the famous debate between George Monbiot and Alan Savory, and it kind of ties into what a lot of people have concluded from this, is that it's not that one side or the other is right or wrong. It's that they're coming from a different worldview that informs how they see these equations and what should be done about them. And, George is often defending the side of what often gets called reductionist scientific conclusion or research in this way, in which you pick something, whether relevant or arbitrary, to optimize for, let's say, the reduction of greenhouse gases, and then everything must conform into a model in which that is done. Or, maybe there are a few multiples, and let's say increase of biodiversity is one of those objectives, and there may be a few others. However, the other side of that is what Alan Savory is usually accredited to, which is looking at it from a holistic perspective, in which everything is relevant and the complexity of living systems must be taken into account, and that there are non-linear outcomes from managing things in this way. Is it inevitable that a view through this scientific method is going to bring you to the kinds of conclusions for technological fixes of farming? And is it just a matter of the worldview that you adopt? Or are there ways to marry the two for the types of kind of healthy rediscovery of land stewardship cultures that include food production, but also stewardship of other resources that can be derived from both scientific and holistic thinking?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think we have to be very careful about the way we invoke science in all of this, because it ultimately, it depends on what question you ask. So I think, the way you formulated that is right. I mean, I think there's a real danger of sort of saying, I've read the science and the science tells us we should do this. And I mean, I do critique Monbiot in my book, because I think, you can't, a scientific study, is only as good, or is only sort of relevant within, the parameters that it's kind of defined, and you have to define them quite tightly. Whereas what we're talking about is, huge kind of ultimately philosophical questions. How should we live? And you can't say the science says we should do this. You can only say the science, gives us. It gives us this little bit of information that's useful to feed into, some pretty kind of grounded decision making. So yeah, I think we do need to put it into much more kind of holistic frameworks. And yeah, it's hard to, you can't really. Yeah, I think there's a real danger of cherry picking. Basically, you can cite an awful lot of scientific studies that you claim to sort of support your particular view. What you can't do is say, the science says we should do agriculture like this, because that's not a scientific question that you can formulate empirically. So yeah, I do think we need. I mean, and I think probably you're right that the Monbiot Savory debate sort of exemplified that talking past of one another with different frameworks. I mean, I have my own views as to who said what and who was right about this or that or the other, but it did exemplify that that sort of larger intellectual problem of how we bring different kinds of knowledges to bear. And again, it sort of goes back to my point about poor pastoralist peoples, is that it's very easy to invoke science as this kind of modernist rationalizing narrative that you people, you don't know what you're doing, you haven't got the data, you haven't got the numbers, what you're doing is wrong, and that can then draw politics into it, draw powerful political or economic actors to sort of move in. And certainly that's a narrative that we're seeing here in the UK. There's a lot of focus on upland livestock farming as being destructive. What a lot of upland livestock farmers would say is, are you joking? My few herds, my few head of cattle compared to the larger fossil fuel system. And what's actually happening here is a kind of rewilding narrative with companies wanting to get carbon credits by planting trees on land that's that farmers have been cleared of, and then immediately it gets into this very oppositional, very politicized debate. So I think we need to I'm certainly not arguing that we shouldn't look at science and data and evidence, but I think we need to do that in a more nuanced way, in a more in a more holistic way than occurred in that debate. And to some extent, I think we need to sort of get over some of our human hubris, that the science, of this, the way that we are implicated into wider ecologies, are so fantastically complicated. We're only just beginning, we're just scratching the surface of a lot of this. And so to kind of claim that actually we know that the best thing to do is, whatever it might be, to manufacture food in, with microbial methods or any other type of technique. I think there's an element of hubris in that. And, I suppose that's where I just go back to, let's look at how we can produce the food and the livelihoods that we need locally, using low energy renewable methods, inspired by, but not not trying to replicate exactly older systems that we know have worked in this type of ecology. And and let's just keep trying to learn and be exposed to the feedback, which is another argument in favor of agrarian localism, really. If you buy a product in the shop, you've got no idea where it came from and what impact it's had, whereas the more that you're implicated in your own local food system, the more that you can get information, get feedback about the consequences of your farming. So I think that's important.
Yeah, it is very important. And I want to go back to something that you said there at the beginning of this explanation, is that the scientific method is often as good as the controls that you put on a test, but also the questions that you are asking. It's very easy to optimize for a singular thing, and it seems to be that we have deferred all of our research to optimize for lowering greenhouse gas emissions, or producing as much food, or optimizing for nutritional density is kind of the new fashionable one. And that I'm never hearing these studies come out of the central question of what is the healthiest food production system for the region in which a farm is located, right? If we were to optimize for that, what would be the conclusions that could come from the same method, the same, verifiable studies and the scientific method that we're used to? But the quality of the question has so much to do with the outcome of the things that we're trying to optimize for. And I think if we asked better questions, if we had a central narrative of the purpose of agriculture is not just the final product or the yield that it comes that is brought to market, but the culture that it cultivates, the relationship of the people who participate in it to the land that they are stewarding, the health and the vitality of the communities that participate in these activities, we would come to very different conclusions, perhaps even with the same methodology.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that cultural connection is absolutely vital, and and also very hard to measure. And this is one of the problems where all the stuff that you can't put a number to tends to be, yeah, whatever, kind of ruled out of
Yeah.
the equation. And often it's it's the non-tangibles and the qualitative stuff that ultimately is most important. But even at a sort of more narrowly technical level, I mean, one of the arguments about the supposed efficiency of the manufactured food route is basically if you're energizing it with PV panels, the argument basically, if you have a field full of PV panels year round, they are able to capture more of the incident sunlight than a food crop like soy. um so then you have this argument that okay, so then we can produce more food per acre than the agricultural method. That isn't necessarily entirely true because the soy is only in the soil for a part of the year, and you may be doing you can produce other stuff. So immediately you start questioning the parameters of these studies.
Yeah.
But also, if the PV panels are capturing this sunlight that the human crop isn't capturing, then obviously that energy is not being captured by something else, which could be weeds. In the field, the weeds might be feeding insects, or other. So there's a whole kind of ecological addendum to it, which you're not picking up in this, as you rightly said, this kind of quite narrow framing around our plants or PV panels, or our crop plants or PV panels are more efficient doing things. And that's where it gets fantastically complicated. And to the extent that I think we can't really answer these, we can talk about life cycle analyses and all these sort of whizzy forms of economic evaluation and so on, but we're always missing some aspect of that context. And I think that can lead us to some very short-termist or inappropriate conclusions. So both at that cultural level, but even at the more sort of narrowly technical, ecological or agronomic level, we have to be super careful in saying that the science says that we should do this, and that's where we
Absolutely.
need to connect to, I think, wider histories and wider knowledges, really, for sure.
Yeah, and out of necessity, anytime you do a study like that, you can't look at the whole picture and eliminate all variables. And so as a result, there's always going to be blind spots in whatever sort of accounting or analysis that you do. And I think this is how so many of the more holistic factors have been left out of this discussion, because you just can't do any single study or even a series of studies that takes into account all of the complexity and the interconnected relationships when you're looking at ecology. And you've been alluding to so many different important parts of this throughout this discussion, but perhaps you can summarize what your counter vision is for this technological removal of farming in the traditional sense. What is a different possibility of how perhaps farming could be central to the solutions that many of these technological fixes are trying to solve for?
Well, I suppose I've been alluding to agrarian localism and kind of food sovereignty. Ultimately, I'm here wearing my Land Workers Alliance T-shirt, which is an organisation in the UK which is associated with the global peasant organisation La Via Campesina. So it's very much, food sovereignty is very much about empowering local people, local communities, moving away from this kind of producer and versus consumer framing to growers and eaters, actually being part of food using food communities. So that's basically it. I mean, a book that I would recommend as a sort of alternative to the regenesis type narrative is Dave Goulson. His book, it's the name of it eludes me. I think it's Silent Planet or Silent Earth. He's a kind of insect expert, and he's done really powerful analyses of the way that agrochemicals, among many other things, it's not only agriculture, but certainly agriculture is critical in what people are calling the insect apocalypse. but his argument is not, therefore we should stop farming and produce manufactured food or get into this land sparing narrative, which he kind of correctly, I think, argues is problematic for all the reasons that we've been touching on. He talks about more home gardening, more allotments, more small scale local production, and he cites some interesting research, which is that when people produce food for themselves, in a sort of amateur, non-commercial way, they don't tend to pour lots of agrochemicals on the food that they're producing for themselves. Like, I wonder why that is.
Yeah,
I
right.
don't think that doesn't. So and that has huge biodiversity benefits. So my argument. I mean, I know we're a long way down this kind of urbanized, industrialized route. So the counter argument to people like me is, you're kidding yourself if you think that we're going to kind of de-urbanize, de-industrialize. I mean, my argument to that is I think it's going to be forced on us anyway by energy realities. So the sooner that we embrace it and try and deal with it and do something about it, the less horrific and chaotic it's going to be. But the answer is to produce the food that we need, not more food than we need, just the food that that we need, not this dynamic of overproduction to try and make enough money out of farming to grow food that we need for ourselves as individuals, as households, as communities, and to and that will inevitably produce food that's more ecologically appropriate locally, that's more diverse than the handful of commodity crops that global farming systems are producing, and that is going to almost certainly produce more biodiversity, less agrochemicals, more diversity in local food landscapes, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, that's sort of what we've tried to do in our own sort of haphazard and humble way on our own farm. There's more people living on my farm than there were when we first came here. There's more biodiversity and there's more food production. It's not a kind of zero-sum game. So I think that's the route that we need to go down.
I love it. And how do you see the role of, let's say, non-farmers in promoting this way of returning to some of the traditional ways of farming and the culture that is built around it? What can people at home do to support this?
Right. I mean, I suppose one answer to that is to sort of break down the whole distinction between farmer and non-farmer, just to take an interest in the food that you eat. So, if you live in a city, if you live in a high-rise block, maybe you can grow some herbs on a windowsill. Maybe that's all you can do. I mean, I like to say that makes you a farmer. I sort of think we need to get beyond this, the sort of narrative of a farmer being somebody in a huge tractor So I think what people can do is, within the limitations of, where they're at and the lives that they're leading, take an interest in the food that you're eating. It can also be a political interest, not just producing food for yourself, but asking questions about, well, how does my neighborhood and community get food? Are there better ways of doing that? Are there more local ways? Are there ways that maybe reward local farmers more? So just starting that kind of conversation, rather than assuming that there is this kind of one size fits all global tech solutionism that's going to kind of buy us out of the problems of the food system. But I think ultimately that is going to lead into some hard questions and some hard politics around, to some extent, around urbanism versus ruralism. Can we sustain the level of urbanization in the world as it is today? I think not. And that then leads into questions over access to land, sort of breaking down large scale land ownership, creating more diverse, smaller scale local farms. And, obviously that then, we get into the question that a lot of politics is designed to sort of try and evade, which is who owns the land and how can ordinary people access the land, not just for recreation. We've got that kind of right to roam sort of debate, which is important and good in its own right. But it's, we need to have a kind of right to farm, right to garden debate. And that's important too.
I love that. I haven't heard that phrased that way. I completely agree. And where would you direct listeners to inform themselves more about these topics so that they can participate in the conversation in a more, educated way and advocate for this in different spheres?
Well, I suppose I'm going to have to plug myself in response to that question.
Absolutely.
So my website, chrissmage.com, I have a blog that I've been doing for a long time, and links to my books, and there's quite a lively bunch of commenters and interesting debates there. But yeah, I'd beyond that, I'd encourage people to sort of get involved in food sovereignty debates, local food debates. There's a lot of local food network. Here in Frome, we have a group, the Frome Food Network, which is just pushing that conversation forward about how we're doing food locally. A lot of issues about food access, helping people in poverty accessing healthy food is a key thing. And then that kind of, starts those conversations about, access to food and, the sort of cost of living crisis and the way that, the existing food system is just kind of extracting value from us the whole time. And, there's good resources. La Via Campesina does a lot of good stuff. There's groups like the ETC group that tracks the corporate malfeasance in the food system. So just trying to sort of get informed locally and non-locally about the bigger politics around this, I think is one of the most important things that people can do.
Brilliant. Yeah, I know La Via Campesina has a lot of local affiliate chapters in many countries, most countries around the world at this point, and they're a great resource for more information, but also tapping into the community of other people around you who are passionate about this and actively participating in it. There are so many great resources out there. I'll make sure to link to those in the show notes for this episode. Chris, first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to put together both of your books. The one in the beginning, A Small Farm Future, about basically preempting the arguments that are later made in the more recent one of saying no to a farm-free future, and contributing to this debate that is so relevant right now. Thank you for taking the time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed it. It's been great. Thanks.
Thanks once again to Chris. I'll make sure to link to all of the resources that he's talked about and how you can get in touch with him in the show notes for this episode on the website at regenerativeskills.com. Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from this show. Our Instagram account at regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators, as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.